Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Another Transformers movie is about to open in theaters, but how many are actually interested in seeing it? This seventh outing into this toy-inspired universe is named Transformers Rise of the Beasts, because it features a set of Transformer characters known as the Maximals, which are Transformers that transform into robotic beasts. So this movie will be the first Transformers movie to feature them, and to be honest, I think that is really the biggest difference between this movie and its 6 predecessors. But the question is, though, will that be enough to get moviegoers to come out and support this movie? To begin to answer that question, let's take a look at how well the 6 previous movies have done, and I'll demonstrate that with this chart showing the global box office for each of the previous 6 movies, along with their respective break-even points. What stands out in this chart is as follows. The highest grossing movie to date was Transformers Dark of the Moon, which earned a very healthy $1,124 million, but it came out 12 years ago in 2011, which was a very long time ago. The next highest grossing movie was the one that immediately followed, 2014's Transformers Age of Extinction, which earned a healthy $1,104 million, but that was also 9 years ago. Something else that stands out in this chart is that while the first 3 Transformers movies, which include Transformers Dark of the Moon, were on a continuous rise in global box office, the movies since then have seen their respective global box office earnings continuously decline, which is why the generated linear trend line in orange is also going downwards. In fact, the most recent Transformers movie to hit theaters, 2018's Bumblebee, has the lowest global box office earnings of the 6, coming in at only $465.2 million. But that movie broke even thanks to it also having the lowest estimated break-even point because of its very low production budget of $102 million. The movie which preceded Bumblebee, 2017's Transformers The Last Knight, is marked in purple on the chart because its final global box office of $602.9 million was greater than its mid-range estimated break-even point of $542.5 million, but was below its upper range estimated break-even point of $651 million. And those mid-range and upper range estimated break-even points were calculated by multiplying the movie's $217 million production budget by both 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. So it's not difficult to see why the studio, Paramount Pictures, cut the budget for Bumblebee way down to only $102 million as a way to try to recapture the probable losses incurred from Transformers The Last Knight. There's also some very interesting data if we take a look at the domestic box office for the past 6 movies. When we do that, we can plainly see that the movie that had the highest domestic box office was the second Transformers movie that came out in 2009, Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. And that was 14 years ago, when that movie earned $402.1 million domestically, and no other Transformers movie before or since has even broken the $400 million domestic threshold. In fact, the domestic box office has been in a continuous decline ever since Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, with the 2 most recent movies only earning a meager $130.2 million and $127.2 million respectively. Thus, domestic public interest in Transformers movies has been in an ongoing decline for 14 years. Obviously, what has kept the Transformers franchise mostly profitable since 2007 has been a very healthy amount of international box office. So let's take a look at a chart that shows not only the domestic box office for the past 6 films, but also the box office from China, the UK, South Korea, and Japan. This is a truly fascinating chart. For the UK, its box office earnings for the Transformers franchise peaked during the very first movie, and was followed by a steady decline through to the 5th movie until it went up slightly for the 6th movie, Bumblebee. The box office for both South Korea and Japan both peaked during the third movie, Transformers: Dark of the Moon, and have since both steadily declined with each film that followed. But the box office from China didn't peak until the fourth movie, Transformers: Age of Extinction, where it surpassed the US box office and has done so ever since, even though it has also been in a steady decline ever since. I highlighted when the US and China box office peaked in this chart using quadratic trends, and I did that in part to illustrate the diminishing global returns that the seventh movie, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts, is up against. Had I been in a position at Paramount to decide whether to greenlight another Transformers movie, I would likely have said no, because of these long-standing diminishing returns. But I suspect Paramount is hoping that the seventh movie may represent a renewal if it can attract a new generation of Transformers fans. The Transformers toys were first introduced in 1984 by Hasbro and Japanese toy maker Takara Tory. So people who had been young enough to play with those toys in the mid-1980s would likely have been in their mid to late 20s and early 30s when the first Transformers movie debuted 23 years later in 2007. That was clearly the demographic that was targeted in 2007, but that was 16 years ago. So those folks are now in their late 30s to their early 50s, which is probably one of the reasons why interest in the franchise has been steadily declining for years. But the Beast Transformers toys were first introduced in 1996, which was 27 years ago. So anyone who may have played with those toys in the late 90s and the early 2000s would be in their early 30s to early 40s today. And that to me is not a good sign, because that may be pushing the level of interest past its prime point, which was probably several years ago. Clearly, the goal of this movie is to attract a slightly older demographic than the one that was initially released 16 years ago. And while this movie might be able to turn the current trends around, whether it will be enough for the movie to become profitable is another question entirely. This movie's plot, as described by Paramount, is as follows. Set in the 1990s, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts will take audiences on an action-packed globe-trotting adventure as the Maximals, Predacons, and Terrorcons join the battle between the Autobots and Decepticons on Earth. Noah, a sharp young guy from Brooklyn, and Elena, an ambitious, talented artifact researcher, are swept up in the conflict as Optimus Prime and the Autobots face a terrifying new nemesis named Scourge, bent on their destruction. Since all of the previous movies have been based on battles between Autobots and Decepticons, this movie's only difference is the introduction of the Maximals, Predacons, and Terrorcons. But the Terrorcons are simply a visually distinctive, grotesque group of Decepticons, so they're just more of the same, as are the Predacons, which are fierce and dragon-like. And Scourge is the leader of the Terrorcons. Michael Bay directed the first 5 Transformers movies, but he stepped back from the director's chair for Bumblebee becoming a producer, with Travis Knight becoming director. For Transformers: Rise of the Beasts, Michael Bay is still one of the producers, but it was directed by Stephen Caple Jr. From watching the movie's trailer, one of the first things that I noticed was the difference in CGI quality as compared with the earlier movies. All of the Transformers in Rise of the Beasts have a less realistic and more cartoonish appearance about them in terms of CGI, and that could work against the movie's box office success. In terms of potential box office earnings, the most recent predicted opening weekend data for the movie is $46 million to $56 million, which isn't all that great, but would be slightly better than the $44.7 million domestic opening weekend box office for the last Michael Bay directed movie in the franchise, 2017's Transformers: The Last Knight. A final domestic total box office range of $93 million to $133 million is also being predicted by the media. And that predicted upper range value is only slightly better than the domestic box office earned by the last 2 Transformers movies, $130.2 million and $127.2 million. But what is this movie's hopes for potentially breaking even? To answer that, I did my own projections based on the predicted opening weekend domestic box office range of $46 million to $56 million. If I project these moving forward with weekly drops in box office of 40 to 30%, and I want to emphasize that these are not the same as weekend-to-weekend box office drops, then I come up with a possible range of final domestic box office performance of around $115 million on the low end to around $187 million on the upper end, which is higher than the current media predictions because they're using weekly percentage drops as high as 50%, which could potentially happen. The midpoint value for my projected range is at $151 million. Now, to predict the final global box office requires looking at a broad range of possible domestic shares, because the previous 6 Transformers movies have had domestic shares ranging from as high as 48.07% to as low as 21.59%, and that's a very broad range. So I did a secondary projection chart in which I calculate the varying potential global box office values by using the lower, mid-range, and upper range projected final domestic box office values and plotting them against intermediate values between domestic shares of 48.07% and 21.59%. And the result is quite interesting. To read this chart, the horizontal x-axis is the domestic shares ranging from as high as 48.07% to as low as 21.59%, going downward from left to right. The green horizontal line at $500 million is the estimated mid-range break-even point for the movie, while the horizontal purple line at $600 million is its estimated upper range break-even point. The blue curve shows the global box office as related to the low-end $115 million final projected domestic box office throughout the broad domestic share range. And what it essentially says is that the only possible way that the movie could potentially break even if its domestic opening weekend box office is as low as $46 million, and its weekly drops in box office are as high as 40%, that its domestic share would have to remain below 22%. But if the domestic box office does perform that poorly, I think it would be very unlikely that it would have an incredibly strong international box office to go along with it, and that's in part due to the casting decisions made for the movie. So if the movie opens to $46 million domestically this weekend and has high weekly drops in box office, I think that you can pretty much dismiss any possibility of this movie being able to break even, especially if the domestic share is above 22%. Now, if the movie has the stronger domestic opening weekend box office of $56 million and it can maintain low weekly drops in box office earnings, then the movie could potentially break even, provided its domestic share does not exceed 30%. But if the movie's domestic share goes above 30%, then it probably won't have a chance of breaking even. Essentially, with such a weak predicted domestic opening weekend box office, the movie's chances of breaking even are rather low because it may not do that well overseas. And I personally think that its domestic share is going to be closer to 40% or higher because the casting choices that were made for Transformers Rise of the Beasts will probably discourage potential moviegoers in China and other Asian countries from wanting to see the movie. In the best case domestic box office projection, if the domestic share is around 40%, then the final global box office for the movie may be around $375 million. Which would be well below the final box office earned for Bumblebee. In other words, what both the media's and my own projections are essentially saying is that Transformers Rise of the Beasts is probably not going to buck the downward trends that this franchise has been suffering from for many years. But we'll have to wait and see how well or poorly it performs this weekend. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.